But transparency, oddly enough, I'm not arguing for opacity. I'm not arguing that people don't get
Yep.
information. But what I am arguing is that a lot of institutions, is it possible that our trust in them was inflated in the past?
Welcome back, amazing friends, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. Now, you've heard me say on the show many times that there's a new divide in our politics. There's something that unites the right and the left, something that our media pundits and our analysts are missing, especially during incredibly divided times in our politics. And you've always thought, well, that's a little naive, Manu. What are you talking about? The country's incredibly divided. There's incredible divisions between the right and the left. Well, today I've got on one of the leading pollsters in our country, Kristen Soltis Anderson. She's a Republican pollster, strategist, and someone that has founded an opinion and analytics firm called Echelon Insights. And Kristen actually wrote an op-ed titled in the New York Times at the end of 2024, "Something important is unfolding in America that hasn't happened in a while." Well, I wonder what that thing could be. And importantly, can we learn something from someone that has studied the data and the trends and the feelings and sways of voters? Because I think that we're building this hopeful majority together. And usually we have on these fascinating interviews and conversations. Sometimes we'll do monologues. Today, I've gotten a fascinating conversation that I think you will not want to miss. So, with that, let's get into a conversation with Kristen Soltis Anderson.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here, and I feel confident I'm going to learn more than be doing any educating in this discussion. So, thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate your sort of focus. I think over the last few years in trying to uncover some of the things that I think a lot of people aren't seeing, and I want to ground us in an op-ed that you wrote actually at the end of 2024 in the New York Times. And the op-ed was about finding areas of common agreement that you think Americans share that most people aren't seeing. Um, Tell me more about that, and tell me more about how you sort of see areas in which you're finding unity across lines of difference.
Certainly. So, there's a lot of talk lately about how divided we are, and it's not hard for me to look into a survey and find areas where it feels like, for instance, Republicans and Democrats are pretty far apart on some issues. But ultimately, what I love about being a pollster is that my job is not just to listen to the loudest voices. My job is to try to listen to as representative a cross section of voices as I can. And so that means there are going to be some folks who have really strong opinions. They consume tons of news. Maybe they have taken up doom scrolling as their new hobby in 2025. But you've got folks that are really, really, really hyper engaged on the right and on the left who are not actually representative of the vast majority of voters who have lives, who are not doom scrolling, who are concerned about what's happening in the country, but spend about 99% of their mental energy on other things. And those folks, I think, are where you find a lot more unity because you find that oftentimes your average voter does not have a set of beliefs that fit neatly into right or left. They're borrowing a little bit from the right, they're borrowing a little bit from the left, they're borrowing from the last interesting idea they heard from their cousin who they caught up with over Christmas. Like it's an interesting sort of patchwork of experiences and things you've been exposed to that create your worldview, and it doesn't all sync up with right or left all the time. And so, stemming from that, we then see that there is really high levels of distrust. That one of the things that seems to unify us more and more these days is high levels of distrust in a whole range of institutions. And you find that among political independents and those who are less engaged, that distrust is actually often higher. Part of it, it's kind of a chicken or egg problem. Are they tuned out because they're distrustful, or are they distrustful because they're tuned out? But this is now being matched by folks who are more partisan on both sides of the aisle. So take something like business. If I had asked voters 10, 20 years ago, do you generally think that you can trust large companies to do the right thing or not? People wouldn't have overwhelmingly said yes, but at least among Republicans, you might have gotten some pretty good numbers there. Or if you had asked colleges and universities, higher education, do you believe that in general they do the right thing? They make smart decisions? You probably wouldn't have found Republicans saying yes, but you probably would have found some folks more on the political left saying yes. Take something like the media. Republicans have not liked the media for decades. That's not new. But now you see that bleed out more and more to others, those who are in the political center and political left. And you see this hitting a whole bunch of different types of institutions. The good news is it means that divides between right and left are lower. The bad news is it is rooted in frustration with the status quo. It is rooted in a feeling that our institutions have not done great, have not been accountable, and therefore uh, we need something radically different, which is something that I think you can channel in a positive direction.
It's fascinating that you talk about this dynamic where the average voter is not represented by the loudest voices, and frankly, that's actually one of the reasons why the show is called The Hopeful Majority. It's actually a riff off of Nixon's silent majority, and the concept being that there is a lot of political lines that we aren't seeing. Before we get into some of the points that you've identified with respect to the people that don't represent, the loudest voices, why are our politics such where only a few voices actually get filtered up? What do you think about our system causes us to have an unrepresentative view of the electorate?
So, if you think about the way that politicians heard from their constituents 20 years ago, when I first moved to Washington, Facebook was a thing that college kids could get on if you had a like .edu email address, but it wasn't really like broadly consumed. Instagram didn't exist. Twitter wasn't really a thing. Social media was.
This sounds like the good old days, by the
I
way.
know it's my birthday's this week, so I've been thinking about how utterly ancient I am. I'm
Happy early
now
birthday.
older than the parent. Oh, thank you. I'm now older than the parents were in the OC, my favorite television show. So I've been grappling with that reality. But back in 2005, if you interned in a congressional office, I mean, your job was you were answering letters that were written into the office, you were taking phone calls from constituents, and you were documenting and logging their concerns. It was very analog. And so, if you're a member, the way you're hearing from your constituents or influential voices is you're hearing from those folks that are calling or writing in letters. There were emails at this point, like you could email your congressman. Um, you could show up at their office in Washington D.C. or at their district office. You could show up at a rally. You could show up at a town hall. Um, but the bar is pretty high, right? You have to have enough time to like go to a town hall. You have to have enough time to put in a call and wait for the intern to answer during business hours. And so, with the advent of the social media era. The good news was political engagement became a little more small d democratized. And this was like the excitement around the politics and social media era when it really first began. It was cool to be working in campaigns for a Twitter or a Facebook or something like that because you were making the world a better place. You were giving the average Joe more of the ability to speak directly to influential people in politics without having to write a big check to attend a fundraiser, or without being a lobbyist, or without having to fly to Washington D.C. to go knock on doors in Congress. And that was seen as a really cool thing. But there have been some downsides to that now. In addition to, hey, anyone can tweet at their congressman, now it's easy for the noise online to be mistaken for reality. And now you have this problem of people who are too online. They think that what's happening in that social media ecosphere is some kind of small d democratic representative sample of the will of the people. And it is also not. It is different. In the same way that not everyone was calling their congressman, not everyone was writing in letters, not everyone was flying up to DC to go knock on members' doors in the House office buildings. It's also the case that the vast majority of Americans are not actually posting a ton about their political views online. And so if you make the mistake of thinking that the noise on the internet is reality, as a policymaker, you can be misled. You can assume that America is more extreme than it is. Because the other thing to remember is that this kind of discourse, I think, oftentimes rewards our worst instincts, right? It's easy to put something out there without having to think about it. You just type, hit send, and it's out. when it's the sort of thing that maybe if you'd stopped and thought about it for another 3 or 4 minutes, you wouldn't have put it out there. Similarly, because people can do this anonymously, they can let their worst instincts take over. And then you have the further factor of these algorithms that, again, I don't think these companies are all bad or all good, but it is true that they are feeding you content that their algorithm believes you want to see and will engage with. Do you engage with things that don't make you feel strong emotions? Not as much, but you engage with something that does make you feel strong emotions. And that's oftentimes the emotion of anger, frustration, and that's why it's so easy to get hooked on doom scrolling. It's this emotional feedback loop of, oh my gosh, I just saw something horrible. And you're staying looking at it and it keeps pushing that same button, giving you that same sort of mental stimulation of, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And that can be pretty unhealthy.
Yeah, you're speaking the show's language. One of the phrases that we've helped popularize is this thing called the outrage industrial complex, and
Yep.
a writer that you may know of, Amanda Ripley. She talks a lot about the outrage economy that we currently live in, and I think a lot about the times, like you described this era, Kristen, before Instagram and Twitter, and I'm just like, man, that those must have been the real fascinating moments and times in history, because there is no immediate jump to the phone. There is no immediate outrageous take. You're actually waiting for news wires to release and dispense information. You're not just counting on crowdsourced information. So here's my question to you as a pollster. In 2024, people describe this as as a podcast election. And being on the podcast, I have to ask you, you know, you describe this world in which social media is not actually representative of the average voter, and yet the claims are made that President Trump going on Joe Rogan's show, independent podcasters tilting a little bit more right, or at least platforming "quote unquote" people on the conservative side of the aisle more than the liberal side of the aisle, caused there to be a more popular shift towards those causes. How do you grapple with sort of the claim of the podcast election, given that social media is frankly just a lot of noise?
Well, there's a difference between producing and consuming. And the vast majority of people are not producing. They're not posting about their political views. That is a subset, and it's usually the folks that are more strongly activated. With that said, one of the reasons why I do think that podcasts were so important in this election is this type of medium is much more personal. You kind of, as a host, build a relationship, even if it's a one-way relationship with the folks who are listening. I hosted a podcast all about polling for 5 years, and I would meet people like out in the wild at pollster conferences who knew tons about me, my family, my dog. And it wasn't because they were creepy stalkers. It was just because they listened to the show. And by nature, the medium of podcast sort of blends the professional with the personal. And you feel like you really know the hosts, or you really have a different relationship to them and the trust you place in them and the favorability and warmth you feel toward them than you do, say, the talking head on television or the anchor of the nightly news that you are watching. It's just a little bit different. And as we've seen trust in institutions decline, I think we've seen a similar shift that trust in authentic individuals has increased in some ways. So that's why I think podcasts wound up being so valuable, is that for folks that are not necessarily interested in tuning into an overtly political podcast, right? They're not going to listen to something that is like Steve Bannon or the Young Turks or what have you. Like they're not interested in that, but they are interested in dating. They are interested in, crazy stories. They are interested in exercise or health. And so it's encountering political or political adjacent content in non political spaces is what made this podcast election happen. And it's why Donald Trump, in my view, was able to gain more cultural relevance. One, than other Republicans certainly have, who are just not as good at tapping into the zeitgeist. But two, it meant that there were people who are not watching perhaps mainstream media. They're not getting the nightly news, but they are hearing, huh, can you believe the government does that? That's so weird. I don't think we should do that. Wait, can you believe that the government has not banned Red 40 or whatever it is? I think the Maha movement is one really interesting example of this, where it was non-political influencers in, say, the health or wellness space who suddenly become part of a political conversation or adjacent to a political conversation. And it opens the door for people who are not hyper political to suddenly say, you know what? Yeah, I do think it's important to vote. And yeah, I am going to go vote for Donald Trump.
You mentioned the lack of trust that has motivated people to latch on to individuals as opposed to institutions. And I'm thinking institutions as people trust a Joe Rogan more than a CNN today, right? Um, and it seems like, according to your 2024 piece, that you see that trust and that decline of trust occurring across political lines. That you see that on the left and the right. What do you think is motivating that trust? Because, Kristen, it's interesting. We work on college campuses across the country, and whether you are at a large state school like UT Austin, or you're in a small private theological seminary in Ohio, or you're, at a place like Harvard and Cambridge, there's just a very deep level of not just mistrust but cynicism that I'm seeing across young
Mhm.
people across the board with any institution that we encounter. What do you think has caused that? And importantly, what do you think is the role of leaders in trying to ameliorate that mistrust? Because I can imagine a democracy, that type of mistrust is not healthy.
So one of the things that I feel obligated and duty bound to push back on is, as
Please.
a contributor at CNN, it is true that for many young people,
I
would
may or
they
may not have
rather?
had CNN purposefully, so I'm glad that you're pushing back. Now we feed
Oh,
into the outrageous short clips. Keep going.
yes, yes. So look, I 100% believe that Joe Rogan has a very strong level of trust with his audience, that people love him, that it's enormous and it's influential. But when breaking news happens and when a plane crashes into the Potomac or something horrifying like that, or there's a terrorist attack somewhere, there are still use cases where an outlet like CNN is indispensable and still is a very widely, suddenly gets a really big audience and has a role to play. But that's why I think this question around what's driving the cynicism, including cynicism with media, is so interesting because, like, when push comes to shove, a lot of people still do say, I like my local newspaper, or when breaking news
Right.
happens, I am turning on to these networks that I might otherwise say I don't necessarily trust. And so, trust in media is this like thorny, complicated thing, where even how we define media these days is like so amorphous. But what's then driving the cynicism, and why is it that young people today are so much more skeptical of everything? So, ironically, I will, when I have this debate with friends, one hypothesis people have is that there's misinformation and disinformation out there, right? It's not hard to stumble across something that is fraudulent information that says, hey, did you know the government is doing X, Y, or Z? Or hey, did you know reporter so and so did X, Y, and Z? And it's like flat out just wrong or fabricated. And that's probably a piece of it, right? That we like that there's that it is easier for that kind of thing to metastasize than if we want to talk like really old technology. 20 years ago, it would have been like a forward, 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 forward chain letter that you sent to like your
The
family or
news might
friends. It
be
would like
over by the time the letter reaches the destination.
exactly. So things,
Right.
the velocity and scale of like conspiracy theories and stuff is a little bit greater. But I am also dismissive of the idea that this is just like a misinformation, disinformation. Gen Zs all had their brain hacks hacked by the CCP and TikTok. Like, I actually think that's not the answer. It's probably at the margins a
Yeah.
problem for sure, but I don't think it's the cause. I do think that when you are consuming news on these platforms that are part of the outrage industrial complex. The irony is we have more transparency nowadays than ever. When I do research and I ask people, hey, why don't you trust industry X or institution X? And I say, what are the things that it would take for you to trust them or trust that they're doing the right thing? People always say, I want transparency and I want accountability. And I always think only one of those is right. Um, Accountability is important, and I'll get to that in a moment. And I think accountability is the thing that is in short supply, and more of it would help to build trust. But transparency, oddly enough, I'm not arguing for opacity. I'm not arguing that people don't get
Yep.
information. But what I am arguing is that a lot of institutions, is it possible that our trust in them was inflated in the past because we didn't have as much transparency?
Mm,
And now we know, take what's going on with Elon Musk and Doge and, his folks poring over every federal grant. I mean, they're getting some things wrong for sure. They're posting saying, oh, we found this one grant. Look, this doesn't do anything. And it actually is important. But there are things where people are like, I can't believe the government was actually spending money on this, or this is crazy. Now we've had that transparency for a while. Like what government spends its money on has in fact been fairly transparent if you can weed your way through the particular federal website and database. But the more transparency we have, the more people are able to find and latch onto things that make them outraged, make them upset, make them angry. Um, which isn't to say transparency is bad, but I don't think transparency in and of itself makes people trust institutions more. In fact, it often just leads them to find more reasons why they think they shouldn't trust a major institution. The accountability is where I think things are key. If, there was a really interesting piece by Derek Thompson at The Atlantic about how the ripple effects of the COVID pandemic have made Generation Z a little more conservative. His hypothesis is that there were a lot of big institutions that let the world get shut down, that disrupted this generation's graduations and, ability to engage and go to school and get started in the economy and all of that when they were very young. And they don't feel like there's been any real accountability for any of it. Their schools were closed for probably too long, and no one ever got held accountable for that bad decision, or bad health information that got put out in the midst of a crisis or people maybe trying to do the right thing, and like there wasn't any accountability for some of that. And it's that feeling of people can do the wrong thing or the little guy can keep getting screwed, and no one's ever held accountable for it. And until there is accountability,
mm.
it's hard for me to imagine that cynicism abating. I think people have to feel like institutions are saying, yep, sorry, we're going to do better. I remember an ad campaign that Domino's Pizza ran. This must have been a decade ago. Where basically over time they were finding that customers were turning away from their pizza. They were like, Domino's is gross. I don't want to order it. And so they ran an ad campaign that said, I think the CEO of Domino's like shows up in these ads and is like, "Hello, America. We hear you. Our pizza's not very good, so we're gonna make it better. The crust is gonna have more seasoning. It's gonna arrive to your house hot and fresh. We want to win your business back." And it's like that kind of thing that I don't know what
It's
the
honest.
equivalent of that is. But it's
Yeah.
honest. It's not trying to like paper something over, and it's saying, you have held us accountable. We promise to do better. And I think
Mm.
that's just in such short supply these days, and would go more of that would go a long way toward repairing some of this trust that has been squandered and broken.
It's almost like the Domino's CEO saying, "Hey, the Domino's pizza was actually always kind of bad, and you are right. So here's how we're going to do it better." I want to put a pin in this Gen Z conservative point for a second. We're going to go there because I actually couldn't agree more with you on the notion of being more conservative. But I want to propose a proposition, which is maybe there's a split in the generation of people that graduated before COVID versus after COVID. But we're going to hold that for a quick second. You mentioned this fascinating point about trust in institutions actually being inflated for a long time. That actually, by us shining the microscope on the patient and letting everybody look through the microscope, now all of a sudden, of course, you're going to uncover faults. I mean, we're a country of 330 million people, all of whom are very different than each other, heavily armed, trying to make it work. How could there not be problems? So, how do you prevent? And I want to ask you actually this question from a personal standpoint: is how do you prevent that skepticism and that cynicism in institutions from becoming nihilism within people? And what I mean by that is I see a lot of people in my generation that have an impulse to tear down, to destroy, conservative or liberal. It doesn't really matter, I think, politically. And there's not a lot of people saying, let's build things. It's a lot of breakdown, not a lot of building. And I think that that breakdown is coming from this sense of these things have never actually worked. you can never actually have anything functioning. So skepticism goes from healthy skepticism to this sort of nihilistic frame of mind. How do you recommend people navigate that personally as they're getting more and more information about the government, their institutions, where they live, etc.?
I think thinking locally is absolutely the key. So if you find yourself immersed in reel after reel, video after video that says, oh my gosh, can you believe this horrible thing happened today? Can you believe this institution was defunded? Can you believe this decision got made? Can you believe these rights were taken away? It can feel overwhelming and it can feel like there is nothing I can do. I am but a tiny boat on this massive turbulent sea. I'm just trying to stay afloat. I can't do anything. Um, Start small. You don't have to run for Congress. You don't have to like find a way to change Donald Trump's mind. You can do something that is more, you know what, I'm going to find a way to make the school in my community a little better. Maybe I'll run for PTA president or vice president, or those are the sorts of things where starting small, you can find places for more optimism because I still do believe that at the local level, you find less of the toxic partisanship that you find nationally because ultimately people are trying to figure out how to get the trash picked up. They're trying to figure out how to keep the roads paved and plowed. And it's those kinds of nuts and bolts thing that is an awful lot of what our government does that is far away from the heat of the hot button debates, and it's a place where you can get involved. There's like a much lower barrier to entry too. You don't have to feel like, oh my gosh, I've got to go. If I want to fix this, I'd have to run for Congress or I'd have to, no, for a lot of local engagement, just volunteering and doing little bits and pieces of things where you're not going to change things overnight single handedly, but you can begin to connect with others who you might find kinship with because you're like, oh, I'm not the only person that thinks this way. This is amazing. That's what I always encourage people who are feeling helpless. I encourage them to think that direction. Now, there are some folks, as you noted, it's not that they feel helpless, it's that they like actively just think there's nothing that can be done and there's no point. But the good news is, in a lot of the data I've seen, I don't necessarily see that as being the position of Generation Z. That a lot of research I've done, when you ask people, do you believe that the next generation is going to be better off or worse off? It is older Americans who are the most pessimistic about the kids these days. That actually, young Americans, they may feel like they're being handed an economy that's not very good. They may feel like the country is on the wrong track. They may feel like a lot of institutions are not worthy of their trust. But there was also still always a sense of, but we'll be able to fix it. Like once we get this other generations to sort of step aside, hand the reins to us, we might be able to fix it. And so I think as we see the generational turnover in both parties, right now, Democrats, it's like particularly acute that they have a lot of folks in their late 70s or 80s who are on the stage. It's not to say people in their 70s and 80s can't make excellent contributions to public policy, but right now, I think especially on the Democratic side, it is a very acute issue that there are not clear pathways for their younger next generation of leaders to rise up and be cultivated. And I think until young people begin to see more of their own generation in big offices, some of that nihilism may also continue to pervade.
Okay, so because you're a pollster, which basically makes you like the Oracle of America, amongst one of many oracles of America, I would not. It would be wrong of me to not ask you two quick questions as it relates to your diagnosis right there. And those two questions are if I was a Republican and if I was a Democrat. So if I was a Republican and I'm President Trump or I represent the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, what would your advice be to me as I govern the country and try to uncover some of these hidden points of unity so that I can build something effective?
So if I'm a Republican right now, one of the things that I'm trying to do is figure out how do I orient government to serve Americans better, to do fewer things, but actually deliver on the more limited range of promises that I'm making. I think another factor in a lot of the distrust is that nowadays government If you're a conservative, you believe government's gotten too big. It's gotten into the business of too many things. And when it tries to do too many things, it's going to do them poorly. And so if you have a government that's doing 500 things poorly, what if you had a government that's more narrow in scope, but it's doing 200 things really well? That's where I think conservatives can focus is, right now, all of this Elon Musk Doge stuff is making a lot of headlines. It's making a lot of people, in Washington and inside the Beltway, it's making their heads spin. And if it winds up, to your earlier point, just being a tearing down exercise, just being Elon Musk and his crew going through with a sledgehammer and demolishing the federal bureaucracy, that's not the full answer. Because the full answer then has to be, how are you building things to be better that the government does need to be doing? We do need to make sure that our nuclear arsenal is safe, for example. We do need to make sure we have a way to monitor and combat potential infectious disease pandemics. Like, those are things that it actually is, even if you're a pretty limited government libertarian conservative like I am, you're kind of okay with the government doing it, but you want the government to do it well and to be doing things quickly and effectively. And you talk to people, anybody who has tried to engage with government probably has some kind of vague horror story of like running into the grinding gears of bureaucracy and finding something that just didn't work well. A few days ago, I tried to set up an appointment to get my daughters, I want to get them a passport because they're little, but they need one. And like the tech behind just making this appointment, I had to use like two different browsers. It kept freezing. It was like, this would be something that I actually wouldn't mind Elon Musk and his buddies making better. And so that's where I hope that energy will go. Not just to, let's take a sledgehammer and do a demolition, but let's rebuild in a way that is modern and effective. I hope I'm not asking for too much there.
Well, I hope so as well, because as a small government libertarian, surely your menu of asks can't be that big. So you've made one or two asks, and let's hope that people deliver on your ask. Now the flip side of that, if I was a Democrat and I'm trying to get back power at this moment, what would your advice to me be?
So I think my advice to Democrats is that they have to be willing to do the Domino's pizza thing a little bit. That if you are the defender of the status quo and your message is, how dare Donald Trump and his minions go running amok through this bureaucracy and this government and these institutions tearing everything down? Everything was great. That's pretty disconnected. Americans didn't think everything was great. They kind of wanted a wrecking ball to go through a lot of these institutions. And so for Democrats, I think the big risk is that they become the party of the status quo, or the party of philosophizing about how institutions are so important and we need to defend them, while not necessarily being connected to the real everyday day-to-day experiences of people who said, you know what, I don't actually think these institutions are serving me well. So that's the thing I would flag for Democrats is, don't, to the extent that they become the party of defending the status quo of institutions that people felt were broken, that's a tough path for them to stay on.
There's an interesting quote, Kristen, that I found in preparation for this conversation, which was actually, believe it or not, it's John Kerry's favorite quote. So I don't know what that says about the quote, but the quote is, all politics are a reaction to felt needs. Um, what do you
Yep.
think is the most important need right now for politicians to play to? What do you think are the impulses or the underlying sentiments that Americans are feeling, that if a politician uncovered today, they could be very successful in building a coalition across party lines?
So I think one of the main needs that is immediate is economic fragility. So there's the cost of living problem that has obviously emerged. And I think right now it's a little bit frustrating when I hear it get talked about, because for a while it was Republicans sort of hammering the Biden administration over the inflation that happened while they were in office. And now suddenly you have Democrats who are saying, why isn't Donald Trump made eggs cheaper? When, like, in reality, if you go to the grocery store today, like, there's a chance the eggs on the shelf were laid during the Biden administration. It's like he hasn't been around that long. I was also very surprised when I was researching what is the shelf life of eggs in the modern American grocery store. But I digress. It's one of those.
Wait, is the shelf life high? What's the deal?
So yeah, so apparently from the minute that the farmer puts it in the carton, you have 30 days to sell it.
Okay. Okay. So
So we're not yet at 30 days of the Trump administration, I don't believe, or maybe we're like just at 30 days.
We're just there. We're just there.
We're just at 30 days as we're recording this. Nevertheless, there is this acute immediate cost of living concern, but it's not just like, wow, Donald Trump has been in office for 30 days and eggs are still expensive because bird flu is raging. And I'm mad at Donald Trump for that. It's more that people feel like, yes, stuff's pretty expensive and it means I can't save as much as I wish I could. And it means that I'm a little worried that like I can make rent this month, but what happens if my landlord raises my rent next month? And it's that precariousness that people are feeling, and they want to feel more stability. Which then brings me to the broader thing people are looking for. They're looking for the world to feel more secure and stable. And that's economic, but it's also they want to feel like there's some sort of sense of public order. And the number of times I do focus groups where people sort of bring up complaints about like I kind of hate that when I go to the store to buy stuff, like I have to get someone to unlock the laundry detergent. Like it just feels like in a functioning society you shouldn't be treating the laundry detergent and the deodorant like it is a controlled substance
Like it's classified documents.
or classified documents. No, those are apparently easier to get these days. I'm reliably informed. That the that there's just a feeling that like things aren't working the way that they are supposed to. Um, and whether that's kind of law and order, crime, public safety type stuff, whether it is feeling like the world is just an unsafe place, um, there's a lot of that agitation that like things don't feel as stable and predictable as they could be. And the irony is Donald Trump is not coming in as like I'm going to make things stable. His message has always had this strange duality about it where on the one hand he's like I'm going to be stability and order and strength, and on the other hand I'm going to be a wrecking ball and I am going to be your bull in the china shop and all of that. I feel like right now, when you ask voters, do you feel like the election, Donald Trump's second term, is it more or less chaotic than the first term? We asked it in our most recent survey, and voters were pretty divided on this question. When we asked, like, do you believe that compared to Trump's first term, he is more or less chaotic? When you look at it by partisanship, you find
Yep.
that like among that there are some interesting.
Yeah, tell us, what did you find?
Yeah, so when you look at it, younger people are the most likely to say that they think of Trump as being chaotic rather than organized. And that correlates a little bit with things like partisanship. I mean, Republicans are much more likely to see Trump as being organized, Democrats more likely to see him as being chaotic. But all of which is to say, like getting back to your original question, what voters are looking for, what needs they need met, is they need to feel like things are not fragile and disordered. They need to feel like stuff's working as it should be, that society is functioning as it should be, that there's some kind of rules and accountability, and that promises made are kept. And that kind of feeling is what will lead people to stop saying, I feel like everything is off on the wrong track. I feel like everything is spiraling wildly out of control.
We're entering this new age of building because for the successful political leaders of tomorrow, they're going to have to respond to this felt need that you're articulating of fragility. Um, Given that, here's my last question, and I always sort of change up the last question. It kind of depends on the way the conversation went and what I think some of the students listening to this conversation would especially be curious about hearing. And I think what I'm hearing right now is I'm graduating from college. What would your advice be to me, Kristen? Uh, of course, beyond working locally, as I think about navigating and making an impact in this new sort of age of building that we're entering, what would your advice be to me about how I should navigate the next decade or so? Is if I'm particularly interested in trying to sort of improve our government, improve our democracy, try to contribute to our country. How should I go about that?
So this unfortunately won't be like the practical advice that some may be looking for. I'm not going to recommend like, go to this website, apply for these jobs, or but what I am going to recommend is that you take the opportunity to be someone who's willing to be a risk taker and recognize that the great thing about this moment, as insane as it often feels and as worrying as some things may feel when you turn on the news, or see what's going on, is I have been in Washington for 20 years, and there has been an awful lot of, but this is just how things have always been done. That is part of how Washington functions. And some of those norms are good things that have meant people sort of stay within the navigational beacons. Maybe it's not a good idea to pardon your family members or offer preemptive pardons to your staff, or maybe it's not a good idea to, fire all the board members from, certain advisory boards. Like there are things that are happening right now that are norm breaking, that are bad, and that I don't really love. But in a moment where norms are being broken, it also means that there's going to be a lot of like, well, but we've always done it this way, that is going to be set aside. And maybe a lot of those things will be good things that are getting set aside. Maybe they're not as, um, maybe not as clear cut as like, don't pardon your family members or whatever that is. There are going to be lots of norms that are getting thrown in the trash can, which means that if in the past you wanted to do something and there would have been naysayers saying, like, well, you can't do that, that's simply not done. Like, I think there's going to be less of that. And that can either end up going in a bad direction with people doing things that would have been considered unacceptable before and should still be considered unacceptable now. But it may mean there's stuff that people were nudged off of, or like, oh, well, that's not how defense procurement works. That's not how K through 12 education works. What are you talking about? Like, I think we really can think a little bit more outside the box on how our government procures submarines or how third graders learn math. Like, there's a little bit more blue sky here that you can fill in. And I'm excited to see if any of the students who are listening take up some of that opportunity.
Well, one thing is for sure that when you have that blue sky, what you need is to be able to have those productive conversations, to be able to listen to people that are different than ourselves. And so I'm so incredibly grateful to you for taking the time, for sharing some of your wisdom as one of the oracles of many oracles of the United States and of our country. And I think especially at this moment, it's fascinating to hear some of the trends that are enabling people to actually build new things. So thank you, Kristen, for joining the show. And I'm so grateful to everybody for listening every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content. We're building this hopeful majority together, people, with productive dialogue, productive conversations, and great guests like Kristen. Kristen, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.